Simon, would you?
Thank you very much. I'm going to say 4 things about this book, but let me preface them by saying that there are 2 reasons to like it. The first is, hey, it's short, and it's well written, and it makes an argument, and it's analytical and very well informed. So thank you very much, Ian. And the second reason to admire it is that you managed to write a book while being director of a large institute, and let me tell you from personal experience, that's not an easy thing to do. So congratulations, and I hope you sell 1 million copies.
Thank you.
Including to the people in this room.
Yeah, there's going to be book sales at the back there afterwards.
I have to say that when I read it, there was a sense in which my life flashed before my eyes, because I've been writing about these topics also for many years. And for those of you who don't remember Rebecca Sutton's, Sarah Gillinson's excellent working paper at ODI, Why Cooperate? It should be available on the website, and it was a review of all the literatures from common property management in forests to small business associations in New York, and to what turns out to be a very large literature on guppy fish about collective action. I recommend that. And I wrote quite a bit around UN reform, including Maxwell's 8 steps towards UN reform, which I may come back to a little bit later on. But the question I asked myself was, it's all very well to have your life flash before you. Does your future also flash before you when you read the book? In other words, can you make use of these ideas to change the way we think about global governance? And these are the 4 things I want to say about the book. The first is, Ian, you're kind of a bit of a misery guts about global problems. You know, you talk about the underbelly of globalization is systemic risk. Global politics is gridlocked, and you quote Pascal Lamy, I think, as talking about the enduring viscosity of global negotiations. I think risk analysis is great. You know, I participate in, as I'm sure you do, in the World Economic Forum global risk analysis. But how about thinking about some good news that also requires global governance? You know, the world we could have if, I don't know, we had science and technology spread more equally, we had innovation going in the right areas, we had the internet accessible universally at speeds that make it useful, unlike on the train between Brighton and London, for example. I think we need to always talk about opportunities as well as risks, and I wrote about that when I was at ODI. And I'd be curious to know whether you think there are 3 or 4 big positive opportunities we could sell. I'm always quoting this Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King didn't stand up and say, I have a nightmare. He said, I have a dream. So I think what's your dream would be interesting to know about. The second comment I want to make is about how we understand collective action and the constraints to it. And I've talked about some of the literature reviews we carried out when I was at ODI on the subject, some of which are referenced here and some of which aren't. I noticed that Kemal Dervis's book is not on here in your reading list, for example, and there are 1 or 2 others. David Hell did some great work on this topic when he was at LSE, and some of that is referenced in your book. You identify some of the constraints early on in the book. Misaligned incentives, short-termism, free riding, enforcement problems, and coordination problems. I wrote them down. I may have missed some. Perhaps you'll tell me later. From our work on this, I identified 2 or 3 others that are constraints to successful collective action. Lack of trust, you know, which I think we see very much around the Syria discussions, for example, as a barrier to collective action. Not having institutions which manage repeated, iterated prisoner's dilemma type game theory of negotiations, where the institutions that manage these, not just in one sphere, but across others, and some issues about that you do pick up later on in the book about the size of groups and who's in and who's out. So I think we have perhaps a bit more work to do together to understand what are the real constraints to collective action in the modern world. Then I came to the ways forward, which are very interesting in your book, although I have to say I have to kind of find them in different places and put them together. You end the book with the 5 Woods Golden Principles. Nari Woods, another council member of ODI, and I want to read them out and then point to some of the other things you say in the book which are not in those principles. These are your 5 Woods Golden Principles. First of all, not all issues require global collective action, so let's be very selective about what we put onto the global agenda. Secondly, selective inclusion of who's in and who's out. So leave out anybody who isn't absolutely essential to a solution. Variable geometry, so that you look for the minimum number of countries you need to get a deal, but they might be different for each case. Legitimacy, which you did talk about in your presentation, and a crucial issue, enforceability, who holds the big stick to make things happen. You go back earlier in the book, and there are some other things which stretch the principles from 5 to maybe 8 or 10, I think. You talk a lot about the importance of networks, and there is, of course, a theory about networks, and you talk about both transactional networks and professional networks, and you say that networks circumvent the most powerful actors in a sovereign state. So it might follow from that that an additional principle is, how do we create professional and transnational networks? What kind of investment do we make in them? And how do we make sure that they contribute? Business is one of those candidates for professional network, but there are many others. And then you have a chapter called The Power of One, which is really about the role of civil society and individuals. You talk about crowdsourcing. You have this phrase, genius unlocked. You talk about digital democracy, the way in which public movements contributed to the Arab Spring. So I think those are all additional and interesting extras, actually. So I took that list, which is stretched from 5 to 8 or 9, and I then compared it with my 8 points, and I think there's a very strong overlap, and perhaps trust is missing. The issue about civil society, which we found very strong in our literature review, was about something that the literature calls network closure. And you will have heard me say this before, I'm sure, but a very interesting question is why, when you have tea bags in the office kitchen, they don't get stolen. I was in the ODI kitchen, there were lots of tea bags upstairs, and the answer is that if you were stuffing the tea bags into your inside pocket, and one of your colleagues happened to walk in and see you, your name would be mud around the institute. What the literature says is that that would be true for everybody except the boss. And I never dared test that proposition when I was at ODI, but Andy, maybe you would like to try it and see. So network closure is about shaming people into taking the right course of action, and using your networks in order to kind of drive that change. So I think we have kind of a way forward here. I think it's more than the 5 principles. It's probably 8 or 10. And then finally, the fourth point I want to make very briefly is then, how do we apply this to a current problem? And the problem I work a lot on, because I'm chair of the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, is climate change. And we've just had climate intersessionals in Bonn, where I think the Russians and the Ukrainians more or less sabotaged one of the core strands of negotiation around procedural issues. And if you ask people in the business, are we going to get a strong deal in 2015, the answer is probably mostly they think not. So, okay, let's then look at the Woods-Goldin amended principles and see whether or not they help us. Does it require global collective action? Yes, it does, because otherwise we're not going to get anywhere. Can we leave countries out? Well, I thought you were a little bit cavalier about saying, well, of course, we're not going to get the Americans to play ball, but it's okay because California and the cities will rescue us. I think that's too easy, actually. But I think that there's something important about incentives from your earlier analysis, which we need to bring back in. How do we make this difficult for the Americans not to join in with? And I'm strongly reminded of conversations that Sheila Page and I had when I was at ODI about trade talks. And Sheila tells a very good story about being tear-gassed in where was it? Yeah. In Seattle. And then about the trade talks collapsing in Cancun. And immediately everybody set about doing bilaterals. And here we are, in Northern Ireland, setting up a big new bilateral agreement. What happens when you do that, Sheila taught me, is that the big issues which need to be the global collective action problems don't get resolved. In that earlier round, agriculture didn't get on the agenda because everybody was doing bilaterals, but the Americans didn't want to put it on the agenda with countries. And I think that's probably going to be true for developing countries of this new round between the EU and the US. So we have to find a way, here's a big challenge, to increase the incentives or make it more costly to defect from the collective for the US. And I don't think it's enough to say that we have selective inclusion. And as to variable geometry, well, yes, but who's going to be left out and what are they going to say about it? And in a way, it's easy to think of ways in which we could have qualified majority voting or representative groups or green rooms with only certain people in the room, but I think it's easier said than done. And enforceability, well, blimey, we have absolutely no enforceability in the Kyoto Protocol and are not likely to have in any climate change thing either. So that makes me, in some respects, more pessimistic, but also I think we have some additional building blocks for an agreement in 2015 around trust, around network closure using civil society, about changing the incentives, about linking issues from one domain to another. What you've done with this book is provide us with the building blocks for a really important conversation. You've built on what others have done before you, including me, of course, but lots of others as well. So I will very much welcome the opportunity to try and apply this to real-world problems, which is in the end the mandate of ODI. So thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon. Ian, I think you'd like to take some of those off.
Yeah.
Straight off.
I was asked who I'd suggest to be the discussant on this, and I said Simon, not because I thought he'd just applaud the whole way through, because I thought we'd get a really interesting conversation going, and you've lived up to my expectation on that. So thank you, Simon, for reading it so carefully. Let me just touch on some of the questions, because I'm sure the others here want to participate in this conversation. Am I all gloom and doom? You know, what I find amusing is that people regard me, say to me often that I'm much too optimistic about globalization. In a sense, this book, and actually I'm writing another one at the moment called The Butterfly Defect, Globalization and Systemic Risk, are meant to be sort of correctives, at least in my own brain, on globalization. And I did begin, and I hope the book emphasizes that I see globalization as the most remarkable progressive force. That's why I don't believe in the dismantling of it. I believe in making it work. There's lots that can be said, including overcoming poverty and a lot of diseases in our lifetimes as the upside of this. But unless we manage the downside, including increasing inequalities, etc., we're not going to get there. Your example of getting broadband on the train, I wish to Oxford as well, hopefully, that's not a global issue. I mean, that's just, you know, fight for it, get it done. That's local, and that's a good example of issues that you shouldn't be dealing with globally. Making sure it's not overwhelmed by spam and cyber attacks, that's a global issue. The question of collective action, I have read very carefully David Held's and Kamal's books, and indeed Kamal's on my advisory council. We've spoken many times about it. This is all incredibly important. I think what I try to do in this book, for once, is not write an academic book where I spend my time referring to everyone else, including all your great work, Simon, but actually just try and lay out the arguments rather simply. There's lots of footnotes, but there's very little reference to other people's work. And it's not because I don't respect them or think that they're great or build on them. It's just because that's not what this book is. In all the other books I write, every second line refers to someone else. This is an attempt to do something else. But it's all part of this, and I think we all trying to push in the same direction. What this book particularly is trying to do is just, if I achieve one thing with it, which is to make people think, I need to read more about this, that will be a good enough achievement for me, just to raise awareness about these issues. And I think, certainly I hope that they read some of the other work you've referred to. Trust, yeah, that's extremely important. Trust in the institutions, I think it's going to become more and more important. I see this as absolutely central on multiple levels, but in an area like cyber, it's going to be absolutely critical. I see us moving to a world where we lose a lot of privacy. We lose a lot of ability to control who knows what we're doing, when. And I think we won't reject that if we trust the people that have the information not to abuse it against us in whatever way, through personal, political, or other greed. So I think that is going to become more and more important. How we create institutions of trust, agencies which are accountable but not thrust into the political churn I think will be important. Finally, on 5 principles and extending them, and climate as an example, yes, I think that's right. Networks, and I referred, explicitly when I mentioned cities, for example, that's a different network. Business is right, and the work of Jean-Francois Richard has influenced me in that respect as well. These are incredibly significant. Unfortunate professional networks, civil society networks, etc. Most of the things that are discussed in the book, in the end, need state actors because you need enforceability in law. And networks are not great at law. And there's also danger of capture. I've looked a lot at ICANN, for example, which is not discussed in the book. But there's a whole lot of suggestions that these things get captured over time. On climate and the US, I agree with you that it's, we have to get the US to the table on a climate agreement. But if we can't, should we have no agreement? And what do we do then? Do we just let this thing stall on for another 5 years? Or do we move forward with some widening coalition? And how do we put pressure on it? And I think that's the sort of conversation that I'm pushing towards.